Angela Thompson walked through the crowded terminal, her first-class ticket tucked neatly in her bag. The early morning flight to Paris had her excited about her mission delivering medical supplies to a refugee camp in Sudan. It wasn't just another routine flight for Angela. As a Harvard-educated attorney and a philanthropist, she had spent her life advocating for those without a voice. She was used to traveling first class, but it was always with a purpose. Today was no different. Her calm demeanor, however, was met with an unexpected and unnecessary challenge. As Angela approached the security checkpoint, she noticed Officer Jacob Reynolds, a middle-aged officer with a self-assured swagger standing at the entrance. His eyes scanned the crowd with a mix of authority and arrogance. He stepped aside as passengers passed, directing them in different lines based on their boarding status. As Angela approached, Reynolds immediately noticed her first-class ticket. The moment their eyes met, something in his posture shifted, a subtle change in demeanor that Angela would later recognize as a signal of his personal judgment. Without even a glance at her boarding pass, Reynolds stepped into her path and pointed toward the regular screening line. "This way, ma'am," he said curtly. His tone dismissive, Angela stood still for a moment, surprised but not intimidated. "I have priority access," she replied calmly, showing her ticket. But the officer was unmoved. He didn't even look at the boarding pass as he pointed toward the long queue. "That's not for you." Reynolds insisted. Angela's heart skipped a beat, but she remained composed. She had dealt with such subtle racial biases before. This was nothing new. "I'm flying first class. I have priority access." She repeated, her voice steady but firm. But Officer Reynolds was resolute, not willing to let her pass without further scrutiny. "I'll need to verify that," he said, stepping even closer. His words felt like an accusation, as if her presence in first class was somehow suspect, something that needed confirmation. Angela, trying to remain calm, asked, "Verify what exactly?" Her voice was, even yet her patience was beginning to wear thin. She was simply trying to get through the line, but Reynolds seemed determined to make a point of her being there. "I decide who gets priority," he said, his voice rising slightly with impatience. "Step aside or you'll delay the other passengers." For a moment, Angela paused. She knew what was happening. It wasn't about security. It wasn't about verifying her ticket. It was about something much deeper: prejudice. With a deep breath, she took a step back, raising her chin slightly as she spoke with quiet authority. "You're making a mistake. You'll regret this." Angela didn't raise her voice, and she didn't display fear. She knew the truth. She was being discriminated against, not because of anything she had done, but because of the color of her skin. As Officer Reynolds' eyes narrowed, a few people around them started to notice the tension in the air. Several passengers stopped and turned their phones toward the scene, subtly recording the unfolding situation. Angela felt the weight of their gaze, but she didn't let it shake her. Instead, she stood tall and remained unwavering, staring directly at Reynolds, refusing to let his cruelty break her composure. She had already faced too many obstacles in her life to let one ignorant officer control her destiny. As Reynolds' grip tightened on her wrist unnecessarily, tightening the handcuffs, his small act of cruelty aimed to inflict discomfort, Angela held her ground. His power trip, his attempt to make her feel small, only fueled her resolve. She could feel the cold metal biting into her skin, but she was unshaken. "You're making a big mistake," she repeated, her tone calm but firm, signaling to the officer that he had miscalculated. She was not some random passenger who would accept humiliation quietly. She was Angela Thompson, an educated, accomplished woman with the means to fight back against the injustice unfolding before her. It was in this moment that the confrontation escalated. Angela knew that if she didn't say something now, things would only get worse. But there was no anger in her words, no frustration, just a quiet warning. "I know my rights," she said, her voice steady as she looked into Officer Reynolds' eyes. "And you're going to regret this." As Reynolds ignored her words and continued with his petty power trip, Angela could feel the weight of the public humiliation he was trying to impose on her. But she wasn't going to let him win. She wasn't going to let this officer or anyone else define her worth. Despite the officer's attempts to make her feel small, Angela's resolve was unbreakable. This wasn't just about a flight or a security checkpoint. This was about standing up for dignity, respect, and the right to be treated fairly. The tension was palpable as the scene unfolded, with more people watching, recording, and whispering among themselves. Yet Angela stood strong, her composure never wavering. She had been here before facing challenges, standing up to injustice, and proving that no one could diminish her sense of self-worth. As she stared at Officer Reynolds, who still didn't seem to understand the gravity of his actions, she knew this was only the beginning of a much larger story, and she was ready for it. Angela Thompson wasn't just another first-class passenger. She was a woman with a mission, one that had been years in the making, shaped by a relentless drive to help those who couldn't help themselves. As a graduate of Harvard Law, Angela had spent her career advocating for the vulnerable, using her legal expertise to fight for justice. But her work didn't stop there. Beyond the courtroom, she had dedicated her life to philanthropy, focusing on improving the lives of underprivileged children across the globe. Today, she was heading to Sudan, a country ravaged by conflict and poverty, where she was bringing medical supplies to treat children who desperately needed care. This wasn't just another trip. It was a continuation of a lifelong commitment to service. Angela's background as a lawyer was only one facet of her life. Over the years, she had built a reputation not just for her legal acumen, but for her compassion and dedication to social causes. She had co-founded several organizations aimed at improving healthcare access in developing countries, and through her humanitarian work, she had seen firsthand the difference that a single intervention could make in the lives of children. She was well aware of the struggles people faced, the challenges of living without basic needs, and the impact that even a small effort could have in alleviating those struggles. The trip to Sudan was just another chapter in her ongoing work to make the world a better place, even if it meant traveling halfway across the world, carrying with her life-saving medical supplies. Her passion for helping others wasn't something Angela had developed overnight. It was deeply ingrained in her from a young age. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood, Angela had witnessed the stark contrasts between the haves and have-nots. It sparked something in her, a desire to change things, to create a world where people didn't have to live in fear of losing the basic necessities of life. After graduating from Harvard, she could have easily taken a more lucrative path, perhaps working for a prestigious law firm, but that wasn't her vision for the future. Instead, she chose to work with non-profit organizations, providing legal expertise for those who couldn't afford it. She would spend long hours in the courtroom fighting for the rights of children, refugees, and marginalized communities. And when her legal work wasn't enough, she would turn to her other skills, such as fundraising and advocacy, to fill the gaps. Her husband, Daniel Harris, shared Angela's sense of purpose. Although his mission was on a different scale, Daniel was the CEO of Horizon Airlines, a company he had built from the ground up. But his journey hadn't been easy. He had started as a baggage handler at a small regional airport when he was just 19 years old, struggling to make ends meet while attending night school. It wasn't glamorous work, but Daniel was determined to climb the ladder, learning every facet of the airline business. By the time he was in his late 20s, he had saved enough money to lease his first plane. Horizon Airlines was born, and from there it grew slowly but steadily. Daniel had a knack for spotting opportunities, particularly in underserved markets, and he focused on building a regional airline that would provide service to cities others had overlooked. Despite the enormous success Daniel had achieved, he never forgot where he came from. He had a unique understanding of the struggles of the working class, something he and Angela both had in common. He built Horizon Airlines with the same values that Angela applied to her humanitarian work: respect for every person, a commitment to fairness, and a belief that success should be used as a tool for greater good. Horizon Airlines wasn't just about making money, it was about connecting people, creating jobs, and offering opportunities to those who needed them the most. Daniel's background shaped the way he ran his company, and it was no surprise that he and Angela had so much in common in their views on service and leadership. Angela's trip today was not only a demonstration of her commitment to humanitarian work, but also a reflection of the partnership she and Daniel shared. The medical supplies she was carrying were meant to save lives in a refugee camp where basic medical care was scarce. In addition to the antibiotics, vaccines, and specialized medical equipment, Angela had packed personal items, including educational materials for the children she would be working with in Sudan. Every item had been carefully selected, every detail meticulously planned. She didn't view her mission as just a task. It was a personal calling, one that she approached with the same dedication she had shown throughout her life. As she settled into her seat on the plane, Angela thought about the work that lay ahead of her. She had often wished she could do more, reach more people, offer more help, but as she thought about the children who would benefit from the medical supplies, she reminded herself that even the smallest efforts could make a huge impact. Today it wasn't just about her. It was about the future she was helping to shape for those children. It was about showing them that someone cared. Someone was willing to stand up and help, no matter the distance or the difficulty. And as the plane ascended into the sky, Angela felt the familiar pull of purpose. This was what she was meant to do. As Angela Thompson approached the check-in counter, she could feel the familiar buzz of the busy airport all around her. The clatter of rolling luggage, the hum of murmured conversations, and the soft shuffle of shoes against the tile floors created a backdrop to her thoughts. She was focused, as she always was, before a mission ensuring every detail of her humanitarian journey was in order. Today's mission, delivering medical supplies to a refugee camp in Sudan, was a continuation of her life's work. Despite her calm, composed exterior, she had long known that her presence in places like this, where privilege and status often intersected, would sometimes make others uneasy, but she was used to it. Or so she thought. Angela handed over her passport and first-class ticket to the check-in agent, a young man with a stern look on his face. She smiled politely as she watched his fingers hover over the keyboard, typing away as he checked her details. A slight flicker of doubt passed over his face as his eyes flicked from the screen to her, then back again. First class to Paris. He asked, his voice laced with disbelief, as though it were an improbable combination. His tone wasn't overtly hostile, but it was filled with an unspoken implication that he wasn't entirely convinced. Angela, sensing the slight, gave a small nod. "Yes, that's correct," she said calmly, placing her boarding pass on the counter in front of him. He tapped a few more keys, eyes narrowing as if looking for a mistake, but after a few moments he handed back her boarding pass without a word and began to check in a nearby businessman, greeting him warmly and without hesitation. No questions, no skepticism. Angela couldn't help but notice the subtle contrast between the two interactions. She'd seen it before, but the sting still caught her off guard every time. The businessman, dressed in an ill-fitting suit, was immediately greeted with a warm smile and an efficient check-in, while she had been made to feel like her first-class ticket was a mistake, an anomaly. A moment of discomfort lingered, but Angela, ever composed, let it slide. She was on a mission, and nothing would derail her focus. She collected her things and headed toward security, still aware of the small, nagging sensation she couldn't shake. As she moved through the terminal, she passed by Officer Reynolds, a mid-aged officer who stood near the entrance to the security lanes. His sharp eyes immediately locked onto her as she approached. She wasn't sure what had drawn his attention, but she knew that feeling all too well. It was the same judgment she had encountered at the check-in counter, and it was clear he had already made a decision about her. Despite her first-class ticket and priority access, she knew instantly that things were about to take an unexpected turn. Reynolds stepped forward as she neared the security line. "Priority screening is that way," he said, with a stiff gesture to the regular lane. His voice was firm and his demeanor like that of a man who was accustomed to asserting authority. Angela paused, surprised for a brief moment. She glanced at her boarding pass, then back at him. "I have priority access," she explained, her voice steady, the calm confidence that came with years of experience in handling such situations evident in her tone. "I'm flying first class." She presented her boarding pass again, this time with a slight emphasis on the words priority access. But Reynolds didn't seem to care about her explanation. Without looking at her boarding pass, he waved his hand dismissively, blocking her path. "That's not for you," he said, as if her presence in the expedited line was a privilege she hadn't earned. His refusal was not just an oversight, it was a clear decision based on something other than security protocols. "Please step aside," he ordered, not offering an explanation or even a moment of consideration. The line was moving, and every second felt like an eternity as passengers behind her began to notice the situation unfolding. Angela, sensing the growing tension, stood her ground. She was no stranger to this kind of treatment, and she was determined to stand up for her right to be treated equally. "I'd like to be treated the same as everyone else." She stated, her voice unwavering but polite. "I have priority access, just like anyone else in first class." She could feel the eyes of other travelers on her, some curious, some uncomfortable. It wasn't just about the line. It was about the unspoken rules that governed places like this, where some people were given the benefit of the doubt while others had to prove their worth. Reynolds' response was swift, and not what she had expected. "I'll need to verify that," he said, stepping closer, blocking her path entirely. His voice was colder now, the initial politeness gone. Angela's stomach tightened, but she remained calm. She had been in situations like this before. This wasn't about security. This was about something far deeper: prejudice, entitlement, and the assumption that someone like her didn't belong in certain spaces. "Verify what exactly?" Angela asked, her brow furrowing slightly, the calmness in her voice now tinged with the first signs of frustration. "I'm simply asking for equal treatment." Reynolds' eyes narrowed, and for a moment it felt as though the entire airport had frozen. The line of passengers, the murmurs of voices, everything faded into the background. "I decide who needs verification." He said, his words sharp and dismissive. "Step aside, or you'll delay other passengers." His command was not just an attempt to control the situation. It was an exercise of power, and Angela, standing there, was the target. At that moment, Angela knew this wasn't about security at all. It was about something much deeper, a biased belief that she, a well-dressed black woman in first class, didn't belong in this space. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she refused to let him see her falter. "I'll be happy to step aside once I am treated fairly," she said, her voice quiet but firm. She wasn't angry. No. Angela had learned long ago that anger was rarely the answer, but she wasn't going to let this slide. She wasn't going to let him get away with this. The seconds seemed to stretch as Reynolds hesitated, his eyes scanning her face, trying to determine if she would back down. She wouldn't. Finally, she took a breath and squared her shoulders. "You're making a mistake," she said, her tone final. "I'm not going anywhere until I'm treated with the respect I deserve." Her gaze was unwavering, and though she didn't raise her voice, there was no mistaking the power of her presence. In that moment, Angela wasn't just standing in the security line. She was standing up for her right to exist in a space that had long been reserved for those who fit a certain mold. People who were given the benefit of the doubt, people who didn't have to prove their worth. She wasn't just challenging Officer Reynolds, she was challenging the entire system that allowed him to treat her as less than. And in that moment, she knew that no matter how this played out, she would make sure that her voice was heard. The tension in the airport had shifted as Officer Reynolds stood in front of Angela, blocking her from the priority lane, his stern expression barely concealing the disdain in his eyes. But as the seconds ticked by, it was clear that this wasn't going to be just another minor inconvenience. Angela could sense the escalation. She had seen this before when someone like Reynolds, given even the slightest ounce of power, used it to assert control, to make themselves feel bigger, more important. The subtle shift in the officer's demeanor wasn't just about the line. It was about something more insidious, the need to humiliate, to put a person in their place, and Angela was now the target. "Step aside, ma'am," Reynolds said again this time, more forcefully, his eyes narrowing. Angela stood firm, not backing down from his challenge. "I need to verify your carry-on," he insisted, his voice cold and commanding. She knew this wasn't about protocol. This was about something else, something personal. She had seen it in his eyes when he first stepped in front of her. I've already shown you my boarding pass, Angela said, keeping her tone calm. I've already explained that I have priority access. If you want to check anything, go ahead, but I expect to be treated with respect, just like every other first-class passenger. Her words were precise, firm, but there was no anger in her voice. She wasn't going to let him provoke her. However, Reynolds was far from finished. With a dismissive wave, he gestured toward her carry-on bag. I need to inspect your belongings, he said, his tone almost dismissive. Everything. He opened her bag with unnecessary force, as if his authority could only be asserted through this petty, intrusive display. As his gloved hands rummaged through her belongings, Angela watched him closely, her patience beginning to wear thin. She knew what he was doing. He wasn't interested in security. He was interested in making her uncomfortable. She had seen officers like him before, those who used their power to belittle others to show them they were lesser. Angela's heart skipped a beat when Reynolds pulled out the first item from her bag, a box of antibiotics. His eyes narrowed as he held it up, inspecting it with exaggerated care. What's this for? He asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. Angela took a deep breath, steadying herself. These are medical supplies for a refugee camp in Sudan. She explained, her voice clear but calm. I'm a humanitarian. I'm going to deliver them to children in need. Her explanation was simple, but it carried the weight of years of hard work and dedication to helping others. This wasn't just some random item in her bag. These were life-saving medications meant to help people who had no other access to healthcare, but Reynolds didn't seem to care. He barely glanced at the papers she offered, containing the required import documentation for the supplies. Instead, he continued to examine the box of antibiotics with the kind of suspicion one might reserve for illegal substances, not life-saving medicine. A lot of trouble for some antibiotics, he muttered under his breath. His words meant to sting. Angela's patience thinned. She was accustomed to questions about her work, to the occasional confusion from people who didn't understand her mission. But this was different. This was an attack on her very character. He wasn't questioning the supplies. He was questioning her. These aren't just some antibiotics. Angela responded, her tone firm now, but not raised. These are going to children who are suffering, children who would die without them. I've devoted my life to this. She was no longer speaking to Reynolds. She was speaking to everyone who might be listening, to every person who had ever doubted the importance of her work. She wasn't just some woman with a ticket and a bag. She was a dedicated humanitarian on a mission to save lives. And yet here she was being treated like she didn't belong. But Reynolds wasn't done. He took out the next item from her bag, a collection of vaccines carefully stored and labeled for easy distribution. Again, he scrutinized it with exaggerated attention, his tone mocking as he held up the vaccine vials. And what's this? He asked, his words cutting through the air. Are you really flying first class to deliver these? Seems like a waste to me. You could have just flown coach and saved some of that money. Angela felt her body tense as the implications of his words hit her. I fly first class when I need to rest and focus on my work, she replied, her voice unshaken but laced with the weight of the injustice she was feeling. That's not relevant to security procedures. Officer in his next remark, however, was the one that truly crossed a line. He leaned closer, his breath colder than before, and he said, I've seen people like you in first class. You don't belong here. The words hung in the air so sharp and bitter that they felt like a slap across her face. People like you. Angela repeated, her heart racing for a moment before she regained her composure. She had heard the subtle racism in his words, the assumption that someone like her, a black woman well-dressed and educated, didn't belong in a space like first class. But this wasn't about class. This was about his need to control, to dominate, and to remind her that in his eyes she was out of place. Angela's response was measured, her voice unwavering, despite the sting of his words. I earned my place here. She said, I've worked for everything I have just like everyone else. Your job isn't to judge me or make assumptions about who I am or why I'm flying. Your job is to make sure I'm safe just like every other passenger. She didn't raise her voice, but every word she spoke was a silent declaration of her power, her right to exist in that space, and her refusal to be intimidated. Reynolds didn't respond right away, but the sneer on his face said it all. "I don't think you understand," he said slowly, his voice dripping with disdain. "First class is for people who can afford it. It's not for people like you, no matter how you try to justify it." Angela's chest tightened as his words washed over her. The humiliation was there, but it wasn't going to break her. "I understand perfectly, officer," she said, meeting his gaze head on. "You're making a mistake, and when this is over, you'll regret every single word you've said to me." As Reynolds continued his invasive search, now examining her personal items with even more exaggerated scrutiny, Angela stood tall. She could feel the eyes of the people around her, the silent witnesses to the abuse of power unfolding before them. She could feel their discomfort, their unease, but she refused to let their discomfort become hers. She wasn't just a passenger, she was a force to be reckoned with, and Officer Reynolds was about to find that out in the hardest way possible. The moment Officer Reynolds made his comment, Angela felt the full weight of his prejudice. "First class is for people who can afford it," he said slowly, his eyes narrowing, as if trying to convince himself more than anyone else. "It's not for people like you." His words hit her like a physical blow, a sharp reminder of the discrimination she had often encountered, but rarely so openly. The implication was clear. As a black woman, Angela didn't deserve to be in the same space as the other first-class passengers, no matter her accomplishments or the reason for her travel. He hadn't just questioned her ticket or her right to be there, he had questioned her very existence in that space, based solely on her skin color. Angela paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. She had experienced prejudice before: subtle remarks, disapproving looks, the feeling of being watched when she entered a room where she didn't belong. But this was blatant. She stood tall, unfazed by his attempt to belittle her. She wasn't going to let him push her into submission. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm and steady, though her heart was pounding in her chest. "You're questioning my right to be in first class, based on what exactly?" She wasn't angry, not yet. She wasn't going to let her emotions control her, but there was no mistaking the force of her words. Reynolds seemed unfazed by her composure, his arrogance still hanging heavy in the air. He looked at her as if she were an inconvenience, as if his biased views were justified. "You heard me?" He repeated, his tone condescending, almost taunting. "People like you don't belong in places like this. You're not what first class is for." Angela could feel the public humiliation creeping in the discomfort of the passengers who had begun to notice the scene. Some had already pulled out their phones, silently recording the confrontation. But Angela didn't care about the cameras. She cared about making sure that this officer knew he was wrong, that he understood that no matter how he saw her, she was just as worthy of respect as anyone else in the airport. She took another step forward, keeping her posture straight and her voice clear. "I'll have to ask you again to treat me with the same respect you show every other passenger here." Her words were firm, not demanding, but not yielding. "Either I am flying first class, and I am fully entitled to be treated as such. I expect you to stop making assumptions based on my appearance." Angela wasn't asking for an apology or for special treatment. She was simply asserting her right to be treated with dignity. She had earned that right. She had earned her place in this world, and she wasn't going to let anyone, especially an officer of the law, try to diminish that. Reynolds didn't respond right away. Instead, he crossed his arms, looking down at her with a smirk that suggested he thought she was overreacting. The arrogance in his eyes made it clear that he believed his prejudices were justified, that his position as a law enforcement officer gave him the right to judge people like Angela. It was in that moment that Angela decided she couldn't let this go. She wasn't going to let him continue with this treatment. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "I believe I'm being discriminated against, and I'd like to file a formal complaint." Reynolds seemed to grow agitated at her request. His smirk faltered, and his eyes narrowed in disbelief. "You're making this difficult," he muttered under his breath, his tone now edged with frustration. "You people always make a scene when things don't go your way." Angela's heart skipped a beat at the racial undertones in his words, the way he framed the situation as if she were the problem, as if it were her fault that he was treating her with such open disdain. But she didn't flinch. She had heard these kinds of comments before, words that attempted to silence, to shame, to keep her in her place, but she wouldn't allow him to do that. She was not going to be made to feel small, not by him or anyone else. "You know what you're doing," Angela said, stepping a little closer. "You're making this situation worse by refusing to treat me equally, and now you're accusing me of being difficult. But it's not me who's creating a scene, it's you." Her voice remained calm, steady, the frustration in her chest simmering beneath the surface, but not overpowering her words. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her angry or upset. Instead, she focused on the facts, on what he had said and done. "I'm asking to speak to your supervisor because I expect to be treated fairly. It's that simple." At that moment, Reynolds seemed to realize that his attempts to intimidate her weren't working. His posture shifted slightly, his shoulders stiffening as he tried to regain some sense of control. "You're just being difficult now," he accused, trying to justify his actions. "You're wasting everyone's time." His eyes flicked to the growing crowd of passengers, who were watching, some shaking their heads, others whispering among themselves. But Angela wasn't concerned about what they thought. This wasn't about them. This was about making sure that he understood his actions had consequences. "I'm not being difficult. Officer," she said firmly, "I'm asking for equal treatment. That's not difficult. You are the one who's making this a problem. I'm asking you to stop treating me differently because of the color of my skin. And if you can't do that, then yes, I want to speak to your supervisor and anyone else who can ensure that I'm treated with respect, just like anyone else in this airport." Her words hung in the air for a moment, sharp and unyielding. Reynolds' face flushed with anger, and for a brief second Angela thought he might snap. But instead he stepped back, his jaw clenched as he looked at her with disdain. "You think you're entitled to something just because of who you are," Reynolds muttered almost to himself. "You think you're better than everyone else." Angela shook her head slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "I don't think I'm better than anyone. Officer, I think I deserve to be treated with the same dignity and respect as anyone else, no more, no less." And with that, Angela took another step forward, determined to see this through, to make sure that no one, no officer, no authority figure could ever again make her feel like she didn't belong. As the situation continued to spiral, Angela could feel the weight of her composure beginning to crack. The injustice of it all, the blatant prejudice, the condescending remarks, and the open disregard for her rights was starting to take its toll. Her pulse quickened, but she kept her breathing steady, focusing on the task at hand. Officer Reynolds stood before her, still holding her boarding pass with a look of sheer defiance in his eyes. She knew she had to take control of the situation before it escalated any further. If he thought she was just another woman who would quietly accept mistreatment, he was gravely mistaken. Angela had been through this before in different forms, in different places, but this time it was different. She wasn't going to let this officer or anyone else define her worth based on assumptions. As she stood there, her mind raced through the possible outcomes of the confrontation. There was one thing she could do, one move that would shift the dynamics of the situation. A phone call. Angela had every right to make a call before being arrested. It was part of the process, something that officers couldn't deny, no matter how determined they were to maintain control. But for Angela, the call wasn't just a matter of procedure, it was a calculated move, one she knew would have immediate consequences. "Officer," she said calmly, her voice measured but unwavering, "I would like to make a phone call before you proceed with any further actions." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that she hoped would break through the tension. She wasn't asking for permission, she was asserting her right, quietly but firmly. Angela knew the law, and she knew that under these circumstances she was entitled to a phone call. Despite the humiliation she was experiencing, despite the unfairness of the situation, she wasn't going to let Reynolds control this narrative. If she was going to be arrested, she would do so on her own terms, and she would make sure the world knew about it. Reynolds didn't react at first, his eyes still locked on her, as if he were trying to decide whether to challenge her request. He had been so sure of his authority, so certain that he could break her down with his condescension and his power. But now, with Angela standing tall, calm and composed, he seemed momentarily taken aback. He hesitated for a brief moment, then scoffed as if the idea of her making a call was laughable. "A phone call? You're just delaying things," he muttered dismissively. His words were sharp, but they lacked conviction. Angela could see that he was starting to second-guess his decisions, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "It's my right to make a call." Angela responded firmly, not backing down. Her tone was respectful, but resolute. The calm in her voice a stark contrast to the rising frustration in Reynolds' demeanor. "You can't prevent me from doing so. And before you proceed with anything further, I'm going to use that right." Without waiting for his permission, Angela reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. She knew the call she needed to make. There was only one person who could change the course of this entire situation in an instant. Her husband, Daniel Harris, was the CEO of Horizon Airlines, the very company whose terminal they were standing in. What Reynolds didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have anticipated, was that the woman he was treating with such disdain was married to the most powerful man in that airport, a man whose influence extended far beyond the walls of the terminal. Angela's fingers hovered over the phone for a moment, gathering her thoughts. She knew that this phone call would not just end the current confrontation, it would ripple through the entire airport and beyond, with consequences that would reach far outside of this moment. She tapped in Daniel's number and waited as the phone rang. The seconds felt like an eternity, but her calm didn't falter. She had already anticipated this moment, and she was prepared for what would come next. "Hey, babe," Daniel answered on the second ring, his voice warm and familiar. Angela felt a brief surge of relief, just hearing his voice. It grounded her in the midst of the chaos, a reminder that she wasn't alone. "I need you at Terminal B, International Department, Security Checkpoint 7. Angela said her words crisp and direct. "Officer Reynolds is attempting to arrest me on fabricated charges. I need you to handle this." There was no panic in her voice, just a quiet certainty. She wasn't asking for help. She was stating the facts, confident that Daniel would handle the situation with the same level-headedness she was maintaining. She had always trusted him. Knew that when it came to matters like this, he was the kind of person who would move mountains to make things right. "I'm fine." She continued, sensing his concern. "I've remained completely calm, and I've got witnesses recording everything." She paused for a moment, then added, "I'll see you soon." As she finished the call, Angela felt a sense of calm wash over her. This was no longer just about her. It was about the bigger picture. It was about ensuring that no one, not Officer Reynolds or anyone else, could ever again make assumptions about who belonged where based on skin color or status. She had taken control of the situation in a way that Reynolds never saw coming, and now he would have to face the consequences of his actions. Reynolds, standing nearby, rolled his eyes in frustration. A phone call. "You're bluffing," he sneered, still underestimating the weight of the situation. He thought it was all some kind of tactic, a simple attempt to stall. He didn't know that the man on the other end of that phone wasn't just any concerned husband. He was Daniel Harris, the founder and CEO of Horizon Airlines, the company that operated the very terminal where this confrontation was taking place. The reality of who Angela was married to had not yet dawned on Reynolds, and the consequences of that ignorance would soon become painfully clear. Angela didn't need to explain the significance of her call. She knew that Daniel's position would have immediate repercussions. He wasn't just any executive. He was the man who built Horizon Airlines from the ground up, a man who had turned a small regional airline into one of the largest carriers in the country. His influence spread far, and in that moment, Angela knew that Officer Reynolds would regret underestimating her, but she kept her composure. She wasn't here to make a scene. She was here to ensure that justice was served not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been subjected to the same kind of unfair treatment. As Angela stood there awaiting the arrival of her husband, she knew that the power dynamic had shifted. Reynolds' arrogance had clouded his judgment, and he had no idea what he was about to face. Angela had taken her stand, and now, with Daniel's help, the situation would be set right. The game had changed, and Officer Reynolds would soon find out just how wrong he was. The airport terminal buzzed with the usual energy of travelers rushing to catch their flights, the din of announcements echoing overhead as Angela stood there still handcuffed, surrounded by a growing crowd of onlookers. Officer Reynolds had finally stepped away from her, his attention momentarily diverted as he looked over the scene, seemingly not understanding the magnitude of the situation he had just created. But Angela knew things were about to change. She had made the call. Daniel, her husband, was on his way, and when he arrived, everything would be different. She had no doubt that the confrontation unfolding here would be the last mistake Officer Reynolds would ever make in his career. Within minutes, the atmosphere in the terminal shifted. A hush seemed to fall over the crowd as a small group of well-dressed executives entered the area. At their forefront was a man whose presence alone seemed to command attention. Daniel Harris, CEO of Horizon Airlines, walked through the terminal with the steady confidence of someone who had built an empire from the ground up. The executive team behind him was composed of legal counsel, senior advisors, and other high-ranking members of Horizon Airlines, all of them walking with a purpose, their expressions grave. Daniel's eyes scanned the scene immediately, locking onto Angela still standing there, her hands cuffed, but her posture unwavering. Angela's breath caught in her chest as Daniel's gaze met hers. She could see the brief flicker of anger in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced with a calm resolve. He didn't speak, not yet. Instead, he made his way toward the scene with an air of quiet authority that only those in positions of true power could exude. He didn't need to announce who he was. Everyone in the airport, from the security guards to the check-in agents, knew exactly who he was. Daniel had built Horizon Airlines from a small regional carrier into one of the largest airlines in the country, a company that had become a fixture in the aviation industry. His name carried weight, and as he moved through the terminal, the space seemed to part for him, the crowd stepping aside almost instinctively. As Daniel approached, Officer Reynolds stood frozen, his gaze now shifting nervously between Angela and the man walking toward him. Angela, still standing tall and composed, couldn't help but notice the change in Reynolds's demeanor. Gone was the arrogance that had defined his actions earlier. Now his posture was stiff, his eyes widening as realization set in. He had no idea who Angela was married to, no understanding of the man whose wife he had just humiliated in front of a crowded terminal. And now, as Daniel's presence loomed larger with each step, Reynolds began to feel the weight of his mistake pressing down on him. Daniel reached Angela without a word, but his eyes softened slightly as he looked at her, his anger controlled but unmistakable. He gently took her hands in his, examining the red marks left by the handcuffs, and gave her a quiet nod. He didn't need to ask if she was okay. He could see the strain in her eyes, but he knew that she was strong, stronger than most. Turning his attention to Officer Reynolds, Daniel's voice when it came was calm, but laced with an undercurrent of authority that made Reynolds flinch. "Officer Reynolds." He said, his tone even but commanding, "I think you and I need to have a word." Reynolds's face drained of color as he stood there unsure of how to respond. He had been so confident in his actions earlier, so sure that he was in control of the situation, but now the reality was sinking in. This wasn't just any woman he had chosen to humiliate. This was Angela Harris, wife of the most powerful man in the airport, and perhaps the most powerful man in the airline industry. Daniel's position as CEO of Horizon Airlines gave him not just authority in the business world, but significant influence in the very terminal they were standing in. And in that moment, Reynolds realized the full extent of his mistake. Angela stood silently, knowing that Daniel would handle the situation with the calm and precision that came with years of experience in leadership. She could already see the shift in Reynolds' posture, his earlier bravado slipping away as Daniel's calm, deliberate approach began to take effect. It wasn't just the recognition of Daniel's power that made Reynolds nervous, it was the knowledge that his actions had crossed a line, and now the consequences of his decisions were about to unfold. Daniel stepped closer to Reynolds, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I want to know why my wife was treated like this." He said, his voice quiet, but with a force that made everyone in the vicinity stop and listen. Why was she singled out and humiliated in front of a crowd of people? Why was she denied her rights as a passenger, a first-class passenger, based on nothing more than the color of her skin? His questions were sharp, each one landing like a blow. "You've made a massive mistake, Officer Reynolds. A mistake that's going to have consequences for you and for this airport." Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting nervously between Daniel and the legal counsel who had now gathered behind him. He opened his mouth to speak, but was cut off by Daniel's continued questioning. "I want accountability," Daniel said, his gaze unwavering. "I want to know why your actions were allowed to continue unchecked, and I want to know what you intend to do to make this right." Ah, there was no anger in Daniel's voice, only a cold, controlled fury that sent a clear message: Officer Reynolds had crossed a line, and now he would have to face the consequences. Daniel's words hung in the air, the weight of them sinking into the very fabric of the terminal. Officer Reynolds had no response. He stood there, visibly shrinking under Daniel's gaze, his hands trembling slightly. He realized too late that his actions weren't just a simple mistake. They were part of a much larger issue, one that Daniel and Angela were both prepared to address. Daniel wasn't just here to protect his wife. He was here to ensure that this kind of behavior, discriminatory, biased, and unjust, would never be allowed to continue under his watch. And with that, Reynolds finally understood the true consequences of his actions. His career, his reputation, and everything he had worked for was about to unravel. The atmosphere in the terminal had shifted dramatically. The once crowded space full of bustling travelers now felt heavy with the weight of the conversation unfolding between Daniel Harris and Officer Reynolds. The severity of the situation was palpable, and those who had been quietly observing the confrontation now realized that what had seemed like a routine encounter between a passenger and security was in fact something much bigger. Something that had the potential to change not only one officer's career, but the entire culture of the airport itself. As Daniel Harris, CEO of Horizon Airlines, stood tall and resolute, his words cut through the tension like a blade. He had made it clear that there would be consequences for Reynolds' actions, and as he spoke, the weight of those consequences began to fall into place. It didn't take long for the airport leadership to take action. Daniel's call for accountability had been heard, and within moments Officer Reynolds found himself on the receiving end of a decision that he had not expected. The airport's director, along with senior security personnel, had gathered around, and they were visibly uncomfortable with the gravity of the situation. The higher-ups, those who held positions of authority in the airport, were now keenly aware of how this situation had been mishandled. They had watched as Reynolds' unchecked behavior had escalated, turning a simple security check into an ugly display of racial discrimination. And now there was no way to ignore the consequences. Reynolds' posture shifted dramatically as the airport director spoke, his voice stern and unwavering. "Officer Reynolds, you are hereby suspended from your duties pending the outcome of an internal investigation into your conduct today." The words hung in the air, a clear message that no one, no matter their position, was above the law. Reynolds stood frozen, his face draining of color as the reality of his actions settled in. He had crossed a line, one that could not be erased, and now he would have to face the repercussions. The internal investigation would not be just about his actions in that moment. It would delve deeper into his history, his record, and how such blatant discrimination had gone unchecked. This wasn't just about a single encounter, it was about accountability on a systemic level. The airport leadership's response, though necessary, was a stark admission of failure. The director, visibly uncomfortable, addressed the gathered group of employees and the legal counsel. "This incident is a failure of professionalism and respect. Officer Reynolds' actions were not in line with the values we stand for at this airport." His words were direct, and they carried the weight of an institution grappling with its own failures. "We must acknowledge that this is not just a matter of one officer's behavior, it's part of a larger problem, a systemic issue that we must address immediately." The statement was important. It wasn't just about holding one individual accountable. It was about acknowledging that this behavior was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern that needed to be broken if the airport was to truly be a place of equality and fairness for all passengers. As the meeting continued, Daniel stood in silence, his gaze steady but unwavering. He had already made his expectations clear, and now he waited for the next steps. He wasn't just there to ensure that Reynolds faced consequences. He was there to push for broader changes, changes that would address the root causes of the discrimination that had occurred. "This is not enough," Daniel said, his voice cutting through the room. Suspending Officer Reynolds is just the beginning. If we are serious about making a real change, we need to address the larger issues at play. His words were measured, but there was a quiet intensity in them. "I want to see anti-bias training implemented for all security personnel. We need to ensure that every employee at this airport understands the importance of respecting all passengers, regardless of their background." Daniel's proposal wasn't just about one officer. It was about changing the entire culture of the airport. "We need to establish clear procedures that prevent this kind of behavior from happening in the first place," he continued. "There need to be checks and balances in place so that passengers are never again made to feel like they don't belong based on assumptions or prejudice." His words resonated in the room. It was clear that this wasn't just an isolated incident. This was a reflection of a much deeper issue that needed to be addressed head-on. Daniel wasn't asking for mere apologies or surface-level fixes. He was asking for a complete overhaul of the system, a commitment to fairness that would go beyond just one incident and create a foundation for lasting change. The room fell silent for a moment as the airport leadership processed Daniel's request. This was no small ask. Implementing anti-bias training, revising security protocols, and ensuring fair treatment for all passengers was a monumental task, one that would require time, resources, and a shift in the mindset of every person working at the airport. But as Daniel looked around the room, he could see that his words had struck a chord. The executives, the airport director, and the legal team all seemed to understand that this was not a request they could ignore. The changes needed to be made, and they needed to be made quickly. There was no going back now. The spotlight was on them, and the eyes of the public were watching. As the meeting came to a close, Daniel stood with a quiet confidence. He had set the wheels of change in motion, and now it was up to the airport leadership to follow through. He had made it clear that Horizon Airlines would no longer tolerate discrimination or mistreatment of any passenger. This was about more than just one officer's actions. It was about setting a precedent, about making sure that no passenger, regardless of their race or background, would ever have to experience the kind of treatment Angela had endured. With that, Daniel turned to leave his gaze falling on Angela one last time, a silent promise in his eyes. He knew that the road ahead would be long, but he was committed to making sure that this incident would spark a movement toward lasting change. This was only the beginning. The repercussions of the incident involving Officer Reynolds rippled far beyond that single confrontation. As news of the altercation spread, the airport found itself at the center of a growing wave of scrutiny. Daniel Harris, the CEO of Horizon Airlines, had made it clear that this was not just an isolated case of poor behavior. It was indicative of a deeper systemic issue that needed to be addressed. The situation had opened a door for a much-needed conversation about racial bias and the unequal treatment of passengers, particularly those from marginalized communities. But this conversation, while long overdue, would not be left to echo in silence. Daniel wasn't just calling for justice for Angela. He was calling for lasting change, a transformation in the very fabric of the airport's culture. The airport leadership, after Daniel's intervention, knew they couldn't just sweep the incident under the rug. They had to confront the problem head-on. A comprehensive review of the airport's security practices was immediately ordered, and a task force was created to investigate not only the actions of Officer Reynolds, but also the broader policies and procedures that allowed such discriminatory behavior to go unchecked. The review included a detailed examination of the entire security process, everything from how passengers were screened to how employees were trained. The investigation revealed a disturbing pattern of biases and inconsistencies that had not been addressed in previous years. Passengers of color, particularly Black and Hispanic travelers, were more likely to be pulled aside for additional scrutiny, while white passengers were often given preferential treatment. This discovery was not a shock to many of the employees who had quietly witnessed these practices for years, but it was still a painful realization for the leadership team. In response to these findings, the airport leadership knew they needed to act swiftly and decisively. One of the first and most important reforms was the implementation of body cameras for all security personnel. The cameras would serve as both a tool for accountability and a deterrent against any future discriminatory practices. The presence of body cameras would ensure that every interaction between security personnel and passengers was recorded, providing an indisputable record of what had occurred during each exchange. This would not only protect passengers from mistreatment, but also safeguard the security personnel from false accusations. It was a step toward transparency, an essential move in building trust between the airport staff and the public. In addition to the body cameras, the airport introduced a transparent complaint process. Previously, passengers who felt they had been treated unfairly had little recourse. The complaint system was convoluted, often making it difficult for passengers to get their concerns heard or addressed. But now the airport had streamlined the process, making it easier for travelers to file complaints. Every submission would be reviewed by an independent panel to ensure that no concerns went ignored. The panel's findings would be made public, and the resolutions to each case would be shared with the complainants, creating a system of openness and accountability that had been sorely lacking. This new system was a direct result of the pressure Daniel had placed on the airport's leadership, pushing them to prioritize fairness and respect for all passengers, regardless of their background. The establishment of new protocols was another crucial reform. These protocols focused on ensuring that all passengers, particularly those from marginalized communities, would be treated fairly and without bias. Security personnel were now required to undergo extensive anti-bias training that would be conducted by independent experts rather than internal departments that might have been complicit in the issues being addressed. The training covered a range of topics, including recognizing and confronting unconscious biases, understanding the impact of racial profiling, and fostering a culture of respect and inclusivity. The airport's leadership understood that systemic change couldn't happen without a fundamental shift in the way employees viewed and treated passengers. The goal was to create a safe and welcoming environment for everyone, regardless of their race, ethnicity, or socio-economic status. These changes weren't limited to just one airport. The influence of Horizon Airlines and Daniel Harris's leadership extended far beyond the terminal where the incident had occurred. Daniel insisted that these reforms be rolled out at all airports where Horizon Airlines operated. This wasn't just a local issue, it was a company-wide problem that needed a company-wide solution. Horizon Airlines had a responsibility to ensure that their passengers were treated with the utmost respect and dignity, no matter where they boarded their flights. By expanding these reforms to all Horizon Airlines hubs, Daniel hoped to set a new standard in the aviation industry, one that prioritized equality and fairness over prejudice and discrimination. The move was a bold one, but Daniel knew it was necessary. The airline was not just a business, it was a community, and it needed to reflect the values of fairness and respect that he and Angela had always championed. As the new policies and procedures were implemented, it became clear that the changes had a ripple effect throughout the airport industry. Other companies took notice of Horizon Airlines' bold stance and began to adopt similar reforms. It wasn't just a matter of following in Horizon's footsteps, it was about creating a more inclusive and equitable environment for travelers everywhere. In the months that followed, the airport where Angela had been wronged became a model for others, demonstrating that change was not only possible but necessary. The conversation about racial discrimination in travel had shifted from a whispered concern to an open and public discussion, one that would continue to evolve as more people demanded fairness, transparency, and accountability in the travel industry. Angela, though still deeply affected by the events that had unfolded, found solace in knowing that her experience had sparked a transformation that would benefit countless others. The systemic changes in place meant that no one else would have to endure the humiliation she had faced. And for Daniel, seeing the changes take root was a testament to the power of using influence for good. It was a victory not just for them, but for every traveler who had ever felt marginalized or unseen. The fight for justice, it seemed, was far from over, but it was a fight that would continue to reshape the future of travel for the better. Angela stood in front of the press conference podium, her heart pounding as the lights of the cameras illuminated her. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind, but now, in this moment, she felt a sense of calm resolve wash over her. She had turned the humiliation she had suffered at the hands of Officer Reynolds into an opportunity, a platform to speak out against the systemic discrimination that had been allowed to fester in places meant to serve the public. The experience at the airport had been harrowing, but it had also opened her eyes to a larger issue. This wasn't just about one officer. This was about the treatment of people of color in public spaces, about the subtle biases that shaped every interaction and the unchecked power that allowed these biases to persist. Angela knew that in order for change to happen, she had to take this moment and use it to fight for something larger than herself. As she addressed the crowd of reporters, Angela's voice was steady and clear. The incident that took place at the airport was not an isolated one. She began, it's part of a much larger pattern of discrimination that exists in public spaces. Whether it's at an airport, a restaurant, or a corporate office, people of color are too often subjected to unfair treatment, to the kind of judgment that is rooted in prejudice, not facts. It's time for that to change. Her words were simple but powerful, and as she looked out at the crowd, she could see that her message was resonating. This wasn't just about her or her own experience. This was about everyone who had ever been made to feel less than to feel invisible or to be treated with suspicion, simply because of their skin color. Angela's personal experience had shown her the depth of the issue. She had always been aware of the systemic discrimination that people of color faced, but standing in that airport handcuffed and humiliated had made her realize just how pervasive it was. She had seen how one officer's bias, unchecked and unchallenged, could turn an ordinary interaction into an ugly display of power. But more than that, she had seen how the system allowed that officer's behavior to go uncorrected until it was too late. It was in that moment that Angela knew what she had to do. She couldn't just walk away from this experience. She had to use it to spark change, to demand that the systems meant to protect people instead work to uplift them, to treat them with dignity and respect. At the heart of Angela's advocacy was the call for mandatory anti-bias training for airport security personnel. She had spoken with enough people to understand that the biases weren't just limited to one officer, they were deeply ingrained in the culture of airport security. We can't continue to ignore the fact that bias exists even within our security systems, Angela said passionately. It's not enough to tell people to be impartial. We need to train them to recognize their biases and address them head-on. She was advocating for a comprehensive approach to anti-bias training, one that didn't just focus on recognizing biases, but also on understanding how those biases affected their interactions with others. Security personnel had to understand that their actions, whether overt or subtle, had real consequences. Their role wasn't just to enforce rules, it was to make people feel safe, valued, and respected. And to do that, they had to be equipped with the tools to confront their own biases. In addition to anti-bias training, Angela called for a fairer process for filing complaints against security personnel. One of the most disheartening aspects of her experience had been the lack of recourse for passengers who faced mistreatment. The complaint process at the airport had been convoluted and opaque, making it difficult for passengers to even know where to turn when they were wronged. Angela was determined to change that. Every passenger deserves to feel that their voice will be heard, that their complaint will be taken seriously, and that they will not be punished for speaking out, she said. She advocated for a transparent, easily accessible system where complaints could be filed and tracked, ensuring that passengers knew their concerns would be addressed. The system needed to be clear and accountable, not just for passengers, but for the employees involved, ensuring that every claim was thoroughly investigated. While advocating for these systemic changes, Angela didn't stop her humanitarian work. If anything, the experience at the airport had reignited her passion for fighting injustice. She had always been committed to helping others, whether it was through her legal work or her work in international humanitarian efforts. But now Angela had a new focus, fighting discrimination in all its forms. She expanded her work to include initiatives that sought to expose and address racial biases, not just in the airport system, but in every public space where people of color were disproportionately affected. Through her foundation, she started a series of workshops and educational programs that focused on raising awareness about the pervasive nature of discrimination and the importance of creating more inclusive environments. These programs didn't just focus on the victims of discrimination. They also trained individuals and organizations on how to recognize and confront their own biases. Angela knew that change wasn't going to happen overnight, but she was committed to seeing it through. She had always believed in the power of education and dialogue to bring about change, and now she was taking her advocacy to the next level. She worked tirelessly to ensure that the airport reforms weren't just an isolated event, but part of a broader movement to challenge discrimination wherever it existed. She met with lawmakers, organized rallies, and spoke at conferences using every opportunity she had to spread her message. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had ever been made to feel small, invisible, or unwelcome because of who they were. Despite the challenges, Angela's efforts began to pay off. The conversation about racial discrimination in public spaces began to shift, becoming not just a discussion about individual acts of bias, but a conversation about systemic change. More airports and companies began to implement anti-bias training programs, and passengers began to see the difference Angela's voice had made an impact. And as she continued her work, she knew that she was helping to create a future where no one would ever have to experience the same kind of treatment she had faced. For Angela, this was just the beginning. The fight for justice, for equality, would continue, but now it was a fight that many were ready to join, and together they would change the world. 6 months had passed since the incident at the airport, and Angela Thompson stood once again at the entrance to the terminal. The familiar hum of the bustling airport surrounded her, but this time the experience was different. Gone was the tension that had once gripped her every step. Gone was the uncertainty of being treated unfairly. As Angela approached the security line, she noticed something immediately. The atmosphere had changed. There were no lingering looks, no whispered judgments, no hint of suspicion in the eyes of the staff. The employees, from the check-in agents to the security officers, greeted her with a warmth and respect that had been missing the last time she had flown. For the first time in months, Angela felt completely at ease as she moved through the airport. She was treated like any other first-class passenger, with efficiency and dignity, just as she had always deserved. This wasn't just a coincidence, she knew. It was the result of the systemic changes that had been put in place in the months following the incident with Officer Reynolds. The airport had implemented comprehensive reforms, including mandatory anti-bias training for all security personnel and the establishment of a more transparent complaint process. These changes weren't just abstract policies. They had made a real difference in how passengers, particularly people of color, were treated. Angela could see it in the way the employees interacted with her and the other passengers around her. The changes had begun to take root, and they were working. The journey she had started 6 months ago, fueled by her desire to ensure that no one else would have to experience the humiliation she had faced, was now unfolding in front of her eyes. As she moved through the terminal, Angela couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. The day of the incident felt like a distant memory now, but its impact still lingered. In those moments of public humiliation, when Officer Reynolds had treated her with such disdain, Angela had never imagined that it would lead to such far-reaching changes. She had been determined to fight for justice, for fairness, but the ripple effect of her actions had exceeded even her expectations. What had started as a personal battle to right a wrong had sparked a movement, a movement that was now making a difference for every passenger who passed through the airport. As Angela reached the security checkpoint, she paused for a moment. Officer Reynolds, the man who had once treated her so unfairly, stood at the front of the line. His posture different now. He wasn't in his usual uniform. Instead, he wore a blue shirt that identified him as part of the community relations team. Angela had heard about his reassignment. After the investigation into his conduct, he had been placed in a new role, one that focused on improving the relationship between security personnel and the public, particularly minority communities. His new position was part of the broader changes that had been implemented at the airport to prevent future incidents of discrimination. As Angela approached the checkpoint, she noticed Reynolds look up from his desk. There was no arrogance in his gaze anymore, no sense of superiority. Instead, there was a quiet acknowledgement of the wrong he had done. Their eyes met for a moment, and Angela saw the change in him. He seemed different. Humbled as she walked through the line, Reynolds stood up from his desk and approached her, his expression serious and respectful. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice soft but sincere, "I just wanted to personally apologize for my actions that day. I was wrong, and I can't tell you how deeply sorry I am for the way I treated you." The sincerity in his voice surprised Angela. She had never expected him to offer an apology, especially not after everything that had transpired. "I appreciate your apology, Officer Reynolds." Angela said, her voice calm and steady, "but it's not just about that day. It's about ensuring that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. It's about making sure that the systems in place are fair to everyone, no matter who they are or where they come from." She could see the recognition in his eyes, the understanding that this wasn't just a matter of personal apology. It was a systemic issue that needed to be addressed. And from the looks of it, Reynolds had begun to take that responsibility seriously. "I know," he said quietly. "I've been working closely with the community relations team to learn from my mistakes. I've been attending the training sessions and meeting with people who have been impacted by the way I treated them. It's been eye-opening, and it's changed the way I view my role in this system." Angela nodded, acknowledging the progress he had made. She didn't expect him to undo the past, but she appreciated the fact that he was taking steps toward change. As Angela made her way to the gate, she reflected on the transformation the incident had sparked, not just in Reynolds, but in the entire airport system. What had started as a deeply personal struggle had led to positive systemic reforms that were making a real difference for passengers of color. The mandatory anti-bias training, the transparent complaint process, and the reassignment of officers like Reynolds to community relations roles were all steps in the right direction. The changes had created a culture of respect, fairness, and accountability values that had been sorely lacking before. But the changes weren't just limited to the airport. The ripple effect had spread beyond that single incident, touching the broader community and inspiring other airports and organizations to follow suit. Angela knew that the road ahead would still be long, but seeing the changes that had been set in motion, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The work she had done, the advocacy she had pushed for, was making the world a better place, one small step at a time. The fight wasn't over. There was still more to be done. But as Angela settled into her seat on the plane, she felt a deep sense of pride. This was the moment when everything had come full circle, the moment when her pain had turned into progress, and when her commitment to fairness and justice had created a legacy of change for generations to come. At Deep Inside HQ, we believe in the power of storytelling to ignite change and inspire action. Every story we share dives deep into real-life struggles, unearthing the challenges faced by individuals fighting for justice, equality, and fairness. These stories are more than just words. They're a call to action, a reminder that each of us has the power to make a difference. If you're passionate about creating a more equitable world and standing up against injustice, then don't wait. Subscribe now to stay connected with our powerful narratives. Engage with thought-provoking content and be part of the movement for positive change. Your voice matters, and together we can turn these stories into a catalyst for transformation.